Hello. Welcome to Bad Takes. I'm Laura McGann, the executive editor of Grid. I'm here with my co-host, Matthew Yglesias, longtime writer.
Hello.
And hey, Matt, how's it going?
Going great.
So every week, Matt and I get together and we talk about a bad take and try to figure out, the layers of badness and try to learn something.
Peel back the onion.
Yes, I like to say the artichoke. But
it's very California.
Yes.
Okay, what do you got this week?
Okay, so this week, here's the bad take I want to talk about. And it's a little bit of a different bad take because it's more of an event than a, say, tweet, which is often where we find our bad takes. So this summer, Planned Parenthood of Arizona decided that they are not going to endorse candidates who have taken money from police unions. So regardless of the candidate's stance or record on abortion rights, reproductive health care, they will not endorse a candidate who has also taken money from a police union.
Huh.
Yeah.
So, that's Arizona, which is just one state.
Right.
Although it's an important state because
Sure.
there's a contested Senate race, there's a gubernatorial
Yes.
election with a sort of an eccentric Republican there, a number of House races. I think that, not that many state affiliates of Planned Parenthood have taken this kind of a hard line. But to contextualize it for people, a lot has happened since then. But in the summer of 2020, I think a number of NARAL affiliates and Planned Parenthood affiliates sort of publicly endorsed defunding police. And this was something that a lot of Republicans then used. They would say, and I think this was particularly prominent in Maine, Susan Collins ran a lot of material saying that Sarah Gideon was supported by police defunding groups. And almost no elected Democrats endorse defunding the police, but lots of elected Democrats support abortion rights and welcome the support of abortion rights organizations. And so that kind of transitive property was an interesting political issue. Most choice organizations, as far as I know, stepped away from that ledge.
Yes.
But Arizona Planned Parenthood just
they dove.
They're running over the ledge.
They are diving in full bore. So what
have they said?
Okay,
to be fair?
So they were criticized pretty quickly, actually, for this, especially on the left. People were saying, "Well, why are you lumping this other issue into the abortion rights issue amid, it's post-Dobbs, you are Planned Parenthood, maybe you should stay focused on your area." Right. And here was the pushback from, I thought it captured it well. So this is the last chair of Planned Parenthood Arizona. Her name is Chris Love. And so she tweets out, "Let me be clear. Democratic candidates cannot hold themselves out as reproductive champions while taking cop money and endorsements, approving cop raises, calling for more cops, or refusing to connect policing and abortion rights. Cops are not our friends in this fight." So it is a clear link between abortion rights and policing. I would say this is a bad take because, should I lay out my thinking on this? Is it apparent on its face, or do I want to unpack, politically speaking?
The obvious critique one could make of this is that these are not closely related issues. That, nobody is the most narrow advocacy organization in the universe. But you have,
right.
You have abortion rights, which is kind of next to healthcare access in general, or contraceptives, or maybe has a conceptual adjacent
domestic violence.
Yeah.
There's a lot of sort of the health care, the well-being of, it really, I think some Planned Parenthood might see men, but in general, the point of Planned Parenthood is...
this is you go from one neighborhood to the next and the changes are subtle.
Yes.
But at a certain point, you're in the middle of the forest.
The point of Planned Parenthood is so that patients can have access to birth control, to sexual health screenings, and
so, for example,
abortion
a police
services.
officer.
Yes. she might use.
Might want contraceptives.
She might.
Might access abortion services.
She might, yeah.
I feel actually confident
I
that
would say
across
yes.
the large number of police officers in the United States, that more than one of them has been to a Planned Parenthood
yes,
clinic.
like a huge percentage. They always say that. There's some data on that, the number of people in America who've gone to a Planned Parenthood is very high. So the reason why, I would say if you are a Democrat or a liberal person, whatever, if your cause right now is to protect abortion rights in America in a post-Dobbs, post-Roe era, you really want to stay probably focused on that. And there's also it's not just that it's sort of maybe distracting or confusing, but interestingly, I think sometimes on the left, there's a sort of misperception about popularity of police in America.
Yeah, people like police.
Since 2020, not only has the number, the sort of support for police in America, it's not even level. Some people, I would say liberals probably think it's gone down as sort of as the rise of Black Lives Matter and attention being paid to police shootings. But in fact, Pew is saying that just from June 2020 to now, the increase in sort of people who want to increase police funding, it's jumped by a lot, like 15 to 20%. So people are and support, people have faith in police. They trust police.
Or, so if you look at Gallup's polling, they are a little less bullish on police, and they do show police confidence as down from where it was 1 or 5 or 10 years ago.
Oh,
but
interesting.
that still means down to 45%
Yes.
of people have a great deal of confidence in police, and they are the third most trusted institution in America. They're below the military and small business, but ahead of literally everything else.
Yeah.
So, I guess I don't want to derail this conversation with too much analysis of the policing issue as an issue on its own. But I think everybody understands that if you were to just kind of take a side swipe at the troops,
maybe that's not
you're asking for trouble, right? And this is not quite as hot a take as that, but it's really, really close, right? And
I think that's useful for maybe people on the left who have everyone around them has similar attitudes about police and, just to try to understand. I think the troop comment sort of helps, right? To contextualize what's going on here. Meanwhile, there are nuanced views amongst the American public on police. There has been increased recognition of police shootings. There needs to be some reforms here. You can't just, I think the public awareness has increased. But then you look at an issue like abortion rights, and actually there's a lot of support nationwide and in specific states like Arizona for access to abortion services. So, strategically, if you're fighting a fight around abortion, it's a relatively there's a broad coalition of people who potentially could support your cause and might even switch sides and in voting for a candidate. So politically speaking, you're tacking on something really controversial to something already controversial and already a difficult fight. And so I don't know. I think a couple things about that. There's the on its face, right, of that's not a good idea to tack something unpopular onto the thing that you're doing. The other thing I think I have noticed is it seems to me that there is a misperception of power right now, that there's a sort of belief on the left that democratic institutions, i.e. the Democratic Party, sort of institutions, older representatives, and it's sort of the establishment, right? Mm-hmm. The establishment is this powerful bloc, and therefore, they need to do more. And so by tacking on, there's a sort of, it makes sense to tack on something important like police because, the establishment is very powerful, and so therefore they should be doing more. The reality is the left just got kneecapped on abortion, right?
Uh-huh.
Roe is, there was a constitutional right to abortion in America, and now there's no constitutional right to abortion in America. And the power of the establishment left over that was zero. The Supreme Court is not, they are going to be a conservative court for a long time. So it's a sort of strange thing to me, like what the perception is of power on the left and some of these issues. So that's my that is to me one of the root problems here.
What's interesting to me about it, I see people say something like this, and I always feel a certain kind of regret, remorse for my earlier activities in the media industry. And I just I feel like I can see the genesis of this kind of take in a digital media newsroom somewhere, and it has escaped from the lab.
Back up here. So one of the things because in the content game, sure,
where you don't need to worry about what does and doesn't win elections, or what do elderly people think about topics. Literally, you and I have both been there, sitting around a newsroom trying to cook up something on a slow news day that's going to be hot enough to get people talking.
Sure. Let's do a talker here. Let's just drop it.
And it's you got smart people kind of free associating, and you can come up with something like, police have always been the enemy of abortion rights because, blah, blah, and I read a really interesting history about Chicago in the 60s. And it's you can spin it up, right? And in academia and in journalism and certain other fields of life, there are really strong rewards to being an original and provocative thinker.
Well, see, this is the problem, right? When you're in the takes business, in the content business, I should say. Gotta keep coming up with more of it every day. You gotta make more.
Right. And so if I wrote an article,
you kind of run out of. Wait, I'm not saying we've run out of things, but some days you gotta come up with something.
If you rolled up and you were like, "Here's my take. We should try to assemble a broad coalition in support of our topic." People be like, right? That's boring, right?
Wow. Yeah.
And that's what I feel like this kind of mentality. Which, to be clear, there are pros and cons to that, sensation-seeking, novelty-seeking aspect of both media and academia. You can press the boundaries. You can expand people's mind. You can introduce them to new topics. Once upon a time, somebody wrote up a hot take that was gay couples should be allowed to get married.
Yeah,
right.
Wild.
And when that came out, it was man, they're stirring the pot. And now that's the law of the land, right?
Yes.
You can change the world with hot takes. But I do not think that you should try to do that in the middle of a hotly contested election, right? That's what's so weird. That's what I mean about escaping from the lab, right? That midterm elections are just not a good time to screw around with. Is there some argument to be made that policing and abortion are the same?
I don't think the role of the journalist is to, look, journalists, that's not what we do, right? We come up with content. We're not strategic thinkers who are how does this play out in an election or not? Maybe if you were doing content for somewhere like a think tank or something, somebody more invested in the actual outcome. I would say, I don't know if we're making the argument right here, right now, saying, don't listen to us. Don't listen to, I don't know. Is that what you're saying?
No, I'm just saying that
there's a lab. Of course, things get unleashed into the conversation, as it were. But Planned Parenthood Arizona made a choice to make this their position.
To essentially do...
But they don't have to listen to people. You can read tapes.
They don't. No, but I think everybody... I think one reason, not to get too meta, but something I like about the format of this show is that it can let us make content out of the quote-unquote point that we're making here is a little banal. But it's correct.
Okay.
Right?
I don't think we're selling anything we do for a living right now. We're listen to our podcast. It's banal.
No.
Read
but
our content.
Our podcast is good and responsible,
yes,
right?
We are
responsible. Social media is
the
petri dish in which wild ideas, maybe we should deliberately disavow any support from police. The other thing, right? They were not even distancing themselves from a position on policing, but from the idea of the police union liking you, right? Suppose you went to a police union shop somewhere
Sure.
and you talk to them in like a respectful way and
Yeah.
you're like, we might have a disagreement
Uh-huh.
about this like one reform about chokeholds.
Sure.
But I want to impress upon you that like our tax and budgetary policies will allow us to have well-financed public services, including your department and your pensions, but also the school system, the EMTs, the transportation, the other things that you rely on. The Republicans, they're trying to kind of buy you off with like they'll wave your little thin blue line flag, but like all they actually care about is like defunding all state and local government.
Right.
And like say I probably couldn't persuade a police union leader with that message in this day and age, but like what if you did?
Sure.
To then be like, no, that's bad.
Yeah.
You talked the guy into supporting a pro-reform candidate. Right?
Yeah.
Like it's really bananas.
Right.
Logical leap in terms of how does the world work.
It's just an assumption that the institution of policing is so bad and corrupt. But see, that doesn't really make sense that we should ignore it. I mean, that's not a good way to go. Like, if you believe that the institution of policing and police unions need to be reformed.
Well, you know what it's like. Here's what it's like, right? Because we're all talking here. It's like, you want a broad coalition. You don't want to take on unrelated issues, et cetera, which is true. In the limit, though, right, if like the Nazi Party of Arizona was like, man, we're really into abortion rights, for whatever reason.
Yeah.
They're like, yes, you would want to disavow them.
I was also thinking, I was going to bring up a Nazi example. I can't even believe it. But I was going to go the other way of like, okay, the police unions are like, well, we've got this fascist running over here. And then we have this, moderate Democrat who seems like they're not going to cut our funding. Maybe we should go with this person. But yeah, you don't know. I mean, like, look, there's a line of you don't want the backing of certain types of people
who are so toxic, right?
Yeah.
But that's where just back to the polling, like the idea
police are not toxic.
That the police officers of Phoenix, Arizona are that toxic is it's it's factually wrong, but B, it's like I think it's like actually offensive, Like what if you are living somewhere and it's like your cousin's a cop and you sort of disagree with him about politics?
Right.
But, like, you still think he's, like, a good guy?
Sure.
And, like, now somebody's coming along and it's like, police are so bad that we are not just, like, going to pass this reform law, but we're going to say they have to be shunned in all walks of life. You're like, I don't know about that, man.
So the other thing with the cops and abortion is the push here on the left is about one of the issues is making sure abortion is not criminalized in America, whether it's a provider or somebody who accesses the services. And so there actually is a connection pretty directly between the cops and abortion services. And maybe you want them on your side and maybe even acknowledging or maybe trying to persuade them that there are more important things they could be spending their time on besides coming to clinics and poking around medical records or whatever the heck. Like the cops of Phoenix there's not, the local polling has shown that people in Phoenix think there aren't enough cops and they need to be funded more. And this was Arizona Republican, another publication in Arizona was published this kind of thing. And, maybe there's a case to be made to say to the cops, hey, like you have other stuff to do. And maybe saying to them, we hate you and do not trust you is not a great way to start off, a potential future in which there are more stringent laws around accessing abortion.
Well, and I do think this is important because, abortion polling is kind of all over the map depending on exactly what it is.
Yeah, it depends on the question.
What you're asking me about.
Yeah.
But some of the stuff that always polls worst or best, depending on which side you're taking, is like when you get people to talk about like criminal penalties for doctors and even more so for women, right? That's like super unpopular. That's like conservatives want to talk about a world in which you like say, and now you can't get abortions.
Right.
And then there just aren't any. Through magic, right? And bringing the kind of like tactile process stuff in, right? Like, is there going to be a special investigations unit that is like looking into quote unquote suspicious miscarriages?
Yes, right.
And I think you do. Like, you want to engage with people in the law enforcement world who, like, I think mostly don't want to do that work. Like, it's
talk about
it's
being
only
ill-equipped, right? Like, if police are ill-equipped to do, they're not equipped. You know, there's been a lot of conversation around this. And, you know, people need mental health services, and the police are like, well, look, we're not equipped for this. Like,
and you're
how
going
are
to
they
complicate.
now you're going to come to the ER where like somebody's having a miscarriage and investigate whether it was a miscarriage or a medically induced miscarriage. I mean, it's just all. It doesn't make a lot of sense.
Right. I mean, it's a weird. So rather than
Yes.
beating this horse into the ground, let's take a break
Yes.
here and then come back and sort of like broaden this conversation
let's
out
do it.
a little bit. Okay, we're back. So, you know, I think this question about policing is sort of a specific example of a larger phenomenon of kind of like wanting to link issues to other issues, and especially wanting to link the abortion rights issue to kind of other social justice topics. And you had another example of this that it's not exactly a take, but, you know, it's worth talking about.
Yeah, this is not a take per se so much as a phenomenon, which is in Congress, a couple of Democrats introduced a resolution that says, you know, we shouldn't criminalize abortion. We should make sure that there is access to it, and we should make sure that medical care for transgender people is accessible and not criminalized as well. You know, and I think that this is interesting, right? Because they if you read kind of the language of it, it's sort of becoming this umbrella issue around gender. I'm going to read, why don't I read a little bit so you can kind of get a sense. Let me just find a good quote here that kind of sums it up. So the resolution is, you know, expressing opposition to the criminalization of essential health care, including the full range of sexual and reproductive health care, such as abortion, gender-affirming care, and contraceptive care, and disapproving of the criminalization of pregnancy outcomes. This, to me, is interesting because it's a linking, but it's also I would almost call it more of a melding of, this is in response really to Dobbs, right? That there's this, you know.
Well, it's in response to two things, right?
Well, okay, but see, I would say this was original. Like, if you were to look at this at first, and if you look at the headline and the name of it and such, it talks about reproductive health care.
Right.
And so, but then you read the text, and it's not issue A and issue B, but pulling together the notion of access to abortion services and birth control and services around gender identity, so, you know, treatment for transitioning and that type of care. So it's sort of creating this, whereas for many years Democrats would talk about a woman's right to choose or abortion as this sort of singular issue, a standalone issue, it's now a subcategory of this larger umbrella term around kind of health care and gender.
Well, I mean, I guess to try to get the timeline on this nailed down, right? I think what happened is that first Florida and especially Texas passed laws that go quite far in terms of banning gender-affirming healthcare for under 18s.
Yeah, teens, yes.
And Texas, I think in particular, you know, really leaned into defining this as a form of child abuse.
Child abuse.
They've had a lot of tumult sort of in their child protective services over this. And I know from, you know, because I talk to people, I hear word on the internet,
Sure.
There was a lot of hope among people with progressive sort of cultural politics views that there would be a backlash. Like a meaningful backlash to this.
Yes.
And I think that there mostly wasn't. I mean, not to say that nobody disapproved, but it didn't seem to be.
I agree, because there was this, when I read, the New York Times did a pull out on this sort of whistleblower who testified in Texas, and she actually left her job. She had worked in child services in Texas, and she was tasked with investigating parents who were supporting their children who identified as trans and were seeking care around, you know, gender identity. And she thought this was ridiculous. There's actual child abuse happening, and she, you know, all of this was happening. And I thought that was so outrageous enough that the public would think, I can't imagine as a parent being investigated for trying to do the right thing for my child. And, the parents were interviewed in this story as well, and they all seemed very, like your typical parent, some of them conservative, maybe some liberal. It was not totally clear what everyone's politics were, but it was a sense of here were kind of small C conservative parents who just were at their wits' end and were trying to help their kids. And the idea that the state would come in and investigate them for child abuse and potentially take their kids away was just so shocking to me.
So I don't think that this was quite perceived by the electorate.
Right. But
as
so
like,
it did not.
As
right.
the overreach.
I thought it would, right? And
right.
I predicted wrong because I don't think it hit in that way. Like there wasn't, as you're saying, a counter movement nationally to go, whoa, this is wild.
Then Dobbs happened.
Right.
And there was a clear backlash.
Yes.
There were substantial rallies in many cities.
Right.
There were lots of articles. Generic ballot polling for the House got worse for Republicans. A lot of their Senate candidates are now losing races where it looked like they were winning. I mean, nobody knows what's going to happen, but there was a real you're starting to see Republicans like scrub anti-abortion language from their websites as they're trying to evade this backlash. So my interpretation of what's going on with this resolution is that from a trans rights standpoint, like this is a quite smart linkage, right? Like a backlash to cultural conservatives. Texas is the state that has probably gone furthest in terms of banning abortion.
Yes.
And so, like, there is a backlash to Greg Abbott and cultural conservatives in the state of Texas.
Yeah.
And, trans rights people, from their standpoint, are, I think, like, wisely hitching their wagon to this train and hoping to ride to victory. Now, I do think there's a question of, from a strictly abortion rights perspective, like, is it smart to let them be on the train in this way? Like, Patty Murray is serving as the kind of broker here. I mean, she chairs the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee in the Senate, which is basically the committee of jurisdiction here. She's also, I would say, unofficially sort of like Chuck Schumer's, like, women's issues lieutenant.
Right.
I think
I think that's fair.
Is the role that she plays in the caucus. So, this resolution has 11 co-sponsors, which is not nobody, but it's like plenty of people are not on this.
Yes.
bill.
This is not a unified, every Democrat in the Senate said, yes, I stand with this. It's not a sort of position statement for the caucus.
Right. So, but Murray, by authoring it, she co-authored it with Tammy Duckworth. She is edging it in that direction, right? I mean, I think there's a difference between her position as a senator from Washington State, where, she's just like it's a blue state, she can sponsor whatever resolution she wants. But there's kind of the implication here that everybody should get on the bandwagon as like a women's issue, as a feminist topic. I mean, it doesn't explicitly say that. And, there's a question of like, is that smart? Right. So like Catherine Cortez Masto, who is in cycle, who is very vulnerable in Nevada this year, she is not on this resolution.
Right.
Right. Whereas she is on the Women's Health Protection Act and other strictly abortion focused things, which is probably sound of her. But I mean, if you feel strongly about access to gender affirming care, which I guess, that's just my interpretation. Like, Patty Murray thinks the gender-affirming care issue is important, and so she's agreed to do the linkage, which is helpful for that topic.
Right. I think it is. When you look at it in that order, that makes sense. And just to note that this language in this resolution is cropping up other places. Massachusetts, they basically have the same language in their resolution as well that passed there. And what's interesting to me is that when we were talking about zooming out into sort of a trend is that, this isn't just an isolated resolution, but I think we've seen this happening, the linkage between abortion rights and transgender rights. We saw it right away immediately after kind of the Dobbs leak, that there was this push that the language around abortion rights was inclusive of trans people who need these same services. And then also a real debate about when to use the word woman, when to not. So I certainly think that this linkage between these two issues is not going away. That this is, Patty Murray sees something and she's going to be pushing it in that direction. And that is a question mark again when there's different, your point about, okay, somebody wrote this bananas idea of gay marriage. Well, it seemed bananas at the time, but it was really important. And then there's this kind of an issue where you're in the middle of a midterm election. And if your goal is, right now we need to stop states from passing laws that are going to immediately put pregnant people's health at risk, and you need to act quickly, that this kind of dragging down one issue with a less popular other issue seems to me, from a strategic standpoint, not the right move if that's your goal.
Right. So I think where we are in agreement, right, is that the linkage is like you damage the interests of the one issue,
right,
for the sake of the other issue.
Yeah.
And I think, people have to make those kind of trade-offs all the time in politics. Like, what do I care most about? Help this, help that. But I do think that what's fashionable currently in sort of left circles is to deny that kind of trade-off exists, and to say that you gain sort of like maximum power by interlinking all struggles, there's no true minimum wage increase until we liberate Palestine, kind of thing, right? No, but the left has always been famous for that, right? That 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago, I'm older than I remember. You'd go to a march about the World Trade Organization, and people would have signs about Mumia Abu-Jamal.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah. No, I mean, yeah.
And I think that has gone from, I don't even know if anybody remembers this stuff, but that just used to be, everybody would laugh at the far left and its lack of discipline.
Right.
And everybody's got to bring their own sign.
Yeah, their
to
own
the
sign
march,
with their own issue. Right.
Regardless of what we're even talking about. But I feel like that mentality has moved closer to the center, complete with in 1999, I was helping to manufacture papier-mâché dolls for a poorly organized protest, and now I'm here scolding people. But it's become closer to the mainstream of how progressives think about things, and I just don't really think that it makes a lot of sense. Of course, if your goal is to free Mumia, then bringing the sign to the protest on the other issue that has more people interested in it, it makes sense for you, right? But it's the protest organizer should make sure that everybody is running a good campaign, right? And I think a counterpoint to all of this is that
Well, here's what I would say, though. I don't think on the issue of abortion rights and transgender rights, I don't think that this is the showing up with your anti-nuclear sign at the, organic food rally for schools or whatever. I don't think it's the same. I think that there is a genuine change in perception of these two issues, to seeing them as intrinsically linked. And the goal isn't just that one is more popular than the other and we're gonna slide it in. That happens in bills, right? You slide in the somewhat unpopular thing into the very popular thing. You kind of hide it in there. I don't think that's what's happening here. I think that there's been a movement around linking these two issues.
Right. Well, so the sort of the counter point to this, the counter strategy, is if you look at Kansas, where they had this referendum on abortion issues and the pro-choice side won,
right,
in a fairly conservative state. And if you look at the group was called Kansans for Constitutional Freedom, was sort of the main runner of ads and stuff on the pro-choice side. And they went really far to try to appeal to the sensibilities of people who are conservative. They ran ads in which the person speaking about why they wanted abortion to be legal talks about being raised in the Catholic Church, talks about how important their faith is to them.
Right.
They did something that I think people who are like highly ideologically invested in feminism would find very annoying.
Yes.
Which was they ran an ad with like a male, middle-aged white doctor talking about how banning abortion would be like a big burden on him.
Sure.
Right? Like
Yeah.
in his...
You know what this is really about.
You know,
like a lot of... Yeah, but
it was the opposite,
but
right?
it's a
They were like centering
decision. Yes.
like the least impacted person in this for the sake of trying to get middle-aged white men to vote the way they wanted to. And Ashley All, who was the communications director for that campaign, you know, has been hired by a national group that is going to try to run a new group separate from Planned Parenthood.
Oh, I didn't know this. Yeah,
that's going to try to run this kind of strategy on abortion, like appeal to the people who actually exist rather than appeal to like the highest order theoretical construct.
Yes.
And I think that that's the tension you're seeing here, right? That linking them conceptually is to say, okay, I have this big picture view of like gender and the human body and like the metaphysics of the universe that says these two issues are the same versus slicing the salami as thin as possible, right? Like I'm a church-going white male doctor who wants to say, look, I should be able to treat patients and deal with their health problems without being second-guessed by some kind of abortion inquiry commission. Right.
And I think what you're saying there is it takes us back to what we were talking about earlier, which is the kind of content/academic world where it's very interesting to talk about transgender rights and abortion rights as linked, right? Like that's just an interesting concept of, okay, well, what is the spectrum of gender and access to healthcare and what does that all mean? And there's some pretty good stuff to think about in there and to write and to have this kind of thought experiment and, you know, got to crank out the content. And that makes really interesting. I legitimately think this is fascinating. But what you're talking about is, you know, when that gets out of the lab and into the real world instead of the hypothetical place of just thinking through things, what you're seeing here is really, I would say, just strategically at odds with the, if you are worried about the immediacy, if your goal right now, your Planned Parenthood, if you want to still exist in the future to provide reproductive health care and abortion services, you probably need that white doctor on board.
Right. But I guess to stand up, though, for Patty Murray here, to me at least, the linkage here makes a lot more sense than the police.
Oh, well, I
linkage.
agree. That's what I'm saying. That there's a sort of interesting idea here, right? That she's linking intrinsically the notion of gender and access to care and your legal right to access adequate care. And I see that. I do.
But some of it also, I think, speaks to the sort of privacy concept that was important to Roe v. Wade, that was important to the Supreme Court decision about contraceptives, that, you know, as a parent, I don't know.
But she doesn't say that, actually. No, she does not talk about privacy.
No, I know.
But that would be very interesting,
But I mean,
because then it would be, if she was framing this, because that would be more like a Roe idea, right? Of a privacy, of a right to visit a doctor and have a private conversation. And that's very interesting. And that would be an interesting
I would say
idea, but that's not what Patty Murray said.
Well, okay, but like as a parent and like my personal backlash to this Texas legislation, I went from thinking that, you know, there was maybe something to the conservative argument that some institutions have gotten like too aggressive in pushing medical transition and stuff on children, to then looking at what they've done in Texas and thinking like, this is like legitimately horrifying to say that like a teenager with the support of their parents and a medical professional is going to have to like answer to, you know, the Attorney General of Texas over, you know, what they want to do, and the total just like disrespect for the autonomy of family decision making and for, again, like people's ability to think these kind of questions through amongst themselves and with their doctors actually did strike me as quite adjacent to some of the issues around, even like late-term abortion stuff, where late-term abortion is quite unpopular. But then you ask people, it's like, well, like, shouldn't there be exceptions for the health and the life of the mother? And most people think there should be. And then you start getting into the nitty-gritty of it. And the question becomes, it's like, well, how is this going to work, like, in practice, right? Like, is the rule going to be that, look, if a doctor and a patient are like, we need to do this?
I like all of what you're saying. I think it's very interesting. I think that is a really interesting take. That is not Patty Murray's take. That is your take.
Okay.
And that is not none of that is in the language of this resolution. And it's not in the language of the resolution in Massachusetts. What they're saying is, whereas we used to talk about abortion as a singular issue, we are now placing it in a larger gender context. And I find that, again, that is very interesting. But when you are attempting to actually quickly and swiftly prevent women from dying during miscarriage, maybe you don't strategically want to have a big picture conversation about what is gender really and how should we think about healthcare as it connects. And I also think it makes a lot of sense to talk about family autonomy as a separate issue. I mean, we saw that with, anti-abortion rights groups when they, parental notification laws were very important because it was this idea of parents having rights and parents wanting to be involved in the decisions about their child's lives and health. And I think that would be, maybe this is a way to approach what's going on in Texas and now being copycatted in other states about kids and parents and doctors. I would be interested to see what happens if there was that political movement.
I want to go like super duper duper wide view here.
All right.
Which is that I feel like a kind of underlying theme in a lot of this space is a sense that I don't quite know how to put it, but that like middle class, potentially white women who think abortion should be legal seem to feel a certain amount of sheepishness about just like insisting on they themselves being like the center of attention for a minute and just being like, nope, your other topics have to go on hold. Like, we're doing our thing. Right? Like the internet is so full of tropes about you've got to be more intersectional. You've got to be more intersectional. Yeah. Like your feminism isn't really feminism unless it's also this other thing. And that I feel like is the kind of like the underlying like substrate to all of this is like, why can't you just say, no, like we just lost this important Supreme Court case. Yes. We've got like a winning issue in the midterms. We're putting our foot down to say like, nope, you've got to talk about the impact of abortion restrictions on normative women.
Sure. And I think that is genuinely happening, that there is this, I think that you're looking at this issue that is affecting half of the population versus this other sort of gender identity issue, which is just a very, it's also important, but it's not this fundamental sort of fight over whether or not half the population has a constitutional right to an abortion, which is just like a big issue that has an immediacy to it. And that's not to say you couldn't also have a gender conversation. But I think you're right. I think that that's a piece of this. And I think that's what I'm driving at is this idea of, strategically speaking, why not just say what you're saying? Why not just say, hey, we got kneecapped on abortion here and there's some stuff that could be done about protecting women's health on this issue. Here's what we want to do. And don't lump in these other issues, whether it's police or whether it's transgender healthcare.
So, okay, to sum up, takes review. I feel like this police take was like genuinely ridiculous. Like one of the worst takes I've ever seen. And I don't know what they're doing. The Murray one, the kind of the gender linkage to me, I think is maybe a little bit questionable, but I can sort of see it. I see what they're going for, particularly because it's not like they're saying, okay, we're like kicking you out of the club if you don't sign on to this other thing, right? There's like more than one pro-choice piece of legislation in Congress. So I see a distinction between like a really bad take and a take that I don't know.
Here's what I would say.
I'm 50-50.
I would say the police one is pretty bad, right? Like that's just lumping in something that's not useful if you care about an issue and you're trying to get something done. I would say almost the second take is worse because it's not obviously dumb on its face. You know what I mean? It doesn't hit you in the face of going, wow, that's clearly one group in Arizona.
It's more insidious.
It's more insidious because the first take is like, wow, there's this wacky thing going on in Arizona, and it's sort of isolated. The reason I would say the Patty Murray thing is worst take in the context of if your goal is to protect abortion rights is that what's happening is a push toward diluting an issue that's very specific. And I think that if you're interested in the abortion issue, diluting it and complicating it around the notion of gender identity is not useful. So I would say the smartness of the second take makes it almost a worse take.
All right. I'm going to let you have the last word there and, just do the wrap up. This has been an episode of Bad Takes from Grid. We're a relatively new podcast, so please tell your friends, tweet about us, rate us on Apple, rate us, wherever you find your finest podcasts. Check out grid.news for lots and lots of great text content. If you get tired of listening to us speak, I'm Matthew Yglesias. My co-host is Laura McGann. Bad Takes is produced by Olivia Reingold.